You don't need to shout to rule. You just have to unsettle in silence. They make no noise. They don't raise their voices. But when they walk in, the air shifts. They don't need to impress. They're not trying to be seen. And yet, they own the room. One day, I asked Machiavelli, how is it that some people don't lead, but still rule? He didn't hesitate. Because the most real power is never announced. It's simply felt. And I understood. Some people don't lead with charisma. They lead with presence. Not because they impose, but because their stillness alone unsettles. They don't argue. They don't compete. They don't explain. They observe. They calculate. They execute. They wield silence like a scalpel. And when they speak, it's to cut where it hurts, not to fill the air. Machiavelli knew this. True power doesn't shout. It waits until the world has no choice but to listen. These people don't stand out by shining, but by being a quiet threat, not through charm, but through the art of waiting, unseen. You've felt them. The woman who's silent, yet knows everything. The man who doesn't assert himself, but never asks for permission. People who don't respond with anger, but with a look that makes you question everything. And then I realized something chilling. They're not cold. They're sharp. They're not distant. They're processing. The world underestimates them. And that's why the world fears them. Because the power you can't read is the power already reading you. Why didn't you respond? Someone once asked me, and I thought, because responding would mean playing their game. Machiavelli had warned me before, in one of those silences of his, heavier than any shout, whoever doesn't control their impulse has already lost. We live in a world that trains us to react. A malicious comment, and you're defending yourself. An unfair critique, and you're already explaining. But power, real power, lives in control. Not in shouting, but in steady gaze. Not in reacting, but in choosing when or if to respond. Some think silence is weakness, but silence isn't emptiness. It's strategy. It gives you time to think, while they rush. It's the pause that unsettles and reveals. Machiavelli once said, "Desperate men expose themselves. All you have to do is watch." And I learned something. Not everything deserves your energy. Not everything deserves your explanation. Sometimes your reaction is the reward they're looking for, and unknowingly, you give it to them. That's why today, when something provokes me, I breathe and wait. Not to suppress, but to choose. Because those who react from ego expose themselves, but those who respond with strategy dominate. Why does everyone go silent when he enters? Because no one needs to see him command, to know he does. There are people who don't intimidate with shouts, or force, or titles. They intimidate with presence. The kind of person who doesn't need to speak, to be heard, who doesn't impose, but unsettles, who doesn't threaten, but makes others choose their words carefully. Why? Because that kind of presence isn't improvised. It's built silently. Machiavelli put it bluntly. The prince who must shout to be obeyed has already lost his power. All that remains is fear of losing it. That hit me hard, because I realized something. True respect is never demanded. It's projected. And to project it, you need two things: inner clarity and the discipline of not justifying yourself, your posture, your firm gaze, your refusal to play certain games. That speaks louder than any speech about who you are. Because the one who constantly explains himself has already lost, and the one who knows who he is remains silent. So next time you feel the air change when you walk in, don't flinch, don't downplay it, don't apologize for the discomfort you cause. Sometimes your very presence is a mirror that others aren't ready to face. There's something more dangerous than a lie, a truth no one dares to say, but you already saw it. You don't speak much, not because you don't know, but because you understand. The one who listens the most holds the greatest power, while others expose themselves to impress. You notice the invisible cues, the change in tone, the diverted gaze, the repeated story, searching for validation. And you don't do this out of distrust. You do it because you've learned. The most dangerous truths aren't spoken, they're felt. Machiavelli once told me, "He who understands too quickly becomes suspicious, but the one who understands nothing is a pawn." So you walk the edge. You see, but don't speak. You notice, but don't correct. Not out of fear, but because you know. In the game of power, information is like fire. You store it, study it, and only use it once silence has done its work. You don't react. You anticipate. And that's what unsettles people, because your intuition can't be tricked, and your silence can't be controlled. Some people walk in and ask if they may. Others walk in and are already inside. You know which one you are. You don't need approval. You don't need applause. And that's exactly what makes you unsettling to many. Machiavelli warned us, power isn't begged for, it's taken, even while trembling. You don't wait for the world to tell you when to speak, when to move forward, when to walk away, because you learn something few truly grasp. He who asks permission to exist has already given up control. Sometimes they call you cold, or distant, or too intense, but that only reveals how unprepared they are for someone who won't trade authenticity for belonging. You didn't come to be liked. You came to make your presence known, and that alone, that quiet presence that doesn't seek validation, is already a silent threat. Because the one who doesn't care to be liked cannot be manipulated. There's a phase where you try to explain yourself. You want others to understand you, to not misjudge you, to see your heart. But then you wake up and you realize that over-explaining is begging to be understood. Machiavelli told me plainly, clarity isn't something you plead for, it's something you project. So you start talking less and watching more. You let your actions speak. You let others reveal more of themselves, while you reveal less of you. It's not arrogance, it's strategy. Because the more you give, the more they can use against you. And you didn't come here to be transparent. You came to be respected. The people who leave the strongest impact explain the least. Those who rule the room don't say it. You just feel it. And you know this, because real power doesn't need an introduction. It only needs presence. There's a type of person who leaves, and when they return, they're no longer the same. They don't come back to fit in. They come back to rule. They don't raise their voice, but now their gaze weighs heavy. They're not looking for approval. Now they set the terms. Why? Because during their absence, they learn something. Power isn't something you ask for. It's something you take. I once told Machiavelli, I've come back, but I'm not the same. And he replied, good, because if you return unchanged, you learned nothing. This is not the return of ego. It's the return of someone who no longer needs to prove anything, who no longer explains, who no longer justifies, who no longer begs for love, because now he knows his worth. Before he stayed silent out of fear. Now he's silent out of power. Before he wanted to belong. Now he knows that being different is his greatest strength, and his presence unsettles, because he no longer shrinks to make others comfortable. You choose, return as the same person, or return as the one who no longer asks for permission to shine. Machiavelli summed it up in one phrase. It's not enough to leave. You must return unrecognizable. You no longer make noise. You no longer announce yourself. You no longer offer explanations, because you've learned what few ever grasp. The most dangerous kind of power is not the one that shows itself. It's the one you feel, without knowing why. Machiavelli once told me with a barely visible smile, "He who cannot be read is already ruling." And you became that, an enigma, a presence that unsettles because it doesn't need to impose, a mind that doesn't react, it anticipates, a soul that doesn't beg, it selects. You no longer seek to be heard. You let the echo speak for you. You no longer wait for justice. You build consequences. You are not revenge. You are structure. You don't punish with words. You correct with distance, with absence, with silence. You became the thing no one saw coming, but now no one can ignore. And you didn't get there by shouting. You didn't get there by competing. You got there by watching, while others burned themselves out trying to shine. Now, you no longer need to dominate, because you stopped playing their game. You built your own, and if you've made it this far, you're no longer on the surface. You're inside. You're ready. Not to be feared, not to be loved, but to be remembered. For the silence with which you changed the rules. This isn't the end. It's the beginning of your inner dominion.